Hey guys, tonight, we begin with someone you've definitely seen before, a face powdered white as marble, lips like crushed roses, and a stare that could silence a parliament. Queen Elizabeth, ma'am. History remembers her as flawless, radiant, regal, divine. But here's what the portraits don't tell you she smelled. Not like failure and not like fear, like power, and power in the 16th century had a scent. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this weird, fragrant little corner of history. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing this sleepy little community stretch across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and take a deep breath. Because tonight, we're not looking at a portrait. We're in the room. And it doesn't smell like lavender. It smells like 1,000 secrets dressed in silk and clove oil. The first time someone stepped into Whitehall, England's shining jewel of courtly splendour, they often didn't notice the gold leaf ceilings or the tapestries from Venice. They noticed their nose hairs curling. You see, Elizabeth didn't walk into a room. She arrived in layers. Layers of silk, yes. Layers of powdered lead on her face, yes. But more than anything, layers of aroma, perfume, sweat, tallow smoke, and the weary breath of 1,000 courtiers who hadn't touched water in weeks. Her presence didn't just command attention, it assaulted your senses, and she knew it. But let's not jump to conclusions. This wasn't a matter of laziness or negligence. It was strategy. The Virgin Queen understood something her enemies didn't in a world without plumbing. Smell was political. The ability to smell like something other than a barnyard made you sovereign. It didn't matter if your garments were stiff with old sweater as long as they reeked of saffron oil and musk scraped from a deer's gland. You were considered refined. Elizabeth perfected this game. She had an entire wardrobe dedicated not just to clothing, but to scent. Her gowns were infused with crushed cloves, dried lavender, camphor, cinnamon, and anything that could temporarily outmuscle the human body. When she moved, she left a trail. Not of grace or glory, but of survival. Now, to be clear, her courtiers didn't complain. Not to her face. Not if they valued their position, their salary, or their kneecaps. But ambassadors wrote home with wonderfully cautious phrasing. One Italian diplomat described her as an air that lingered, which, frankly, sounds less like a compliment and more like an air freshener giving up the ghost. And yet, that was the goal. To linger. To imprint, to make sure no one forgot they had been in the presence of divinity even if they needed a nap and a vinegar cloth afterward. This is where the illusion gets sharp. Elizabeth's scent wasn't simply a cover-up, it was her crown. You could see the jewels, you could hear the titles, but you could smell the authority. It was calculated, orchestrated, weaponized, and it worked. She couldn't control the wars, she couldn't control the men around her, but she could control what entered their nostrils when they approached. In a room full of sweaty dukes, greasy advisors, and half-rotting diplomats, she didn't just rise above, she overwhelmed. This is what no painting tells you, that the same woman praised as England's Gloriana could change the mood of a council chamber in seconds, not with words, but with the overpowering fusion of ambergris and desperation. You didn't lean closer to hear her. You leaned back, instinctively, because your senses had already surrendered. Let's be honest, you've probably never considered the tactical use of stink, but Elizabeth did. She had no choice. Because the 16th century was not a kind time for the body. People didn't wash. Water was considered dangerous. Doctors warned that it opened your pores to miasmas, which is Renaissance speak for evil breezes. Baths were suspicious. Soap was for laundry. If that, and deodorant, that was called hope. So instead, people layered. Not just fabric but fiction. They perfumed. They powdered. They stuffed orange peels into their sleeves and stitched rosemary into their undergarments. And Elizabeth led the charge, a queen made of velvet and vapour. She wore her myth like a fog. You could see her coming from across the room, but long before you saw her, you smelled her. And that smell told you this is power. Of course, not everyone could afford that. Perfume was expensive. Musk had to be scraped from deer glands. Civet was secreted from the back end of a wild cat. Ambergris was literal whale vomit, left to ferment in the sun for months. This wasn't luxury, it was a commitment to illusion, and in that illusion, Elizabeth reigned supreme. She didn't need to be clean, she needed to be remembered. That's the part we forget. We see the portraits and imagine someone above discomfort, above sweat, above the grime of daily life. But the truth is, her body did what all bodies do. It ached, it leaked, it fought back, and in response, she buried it under layers of silk, of scent, of distance, because in a world where no one bathed and no one admitted they smelled, the most powerful thing a woman could do was make you pretend she didn't. So, tonight, as you rest your head on freshly laundered sheets and let the air conditioner hum you towards sleep, take a moment to imagine a throne room not filled with incense or sacred silence, but with something thicker, something denser, the perfume of fear, the sweat of statecraft, the odour of beauty, slowly losing its battle. That, my friend, was Elizabeth's England, and it didn't smell like roses. It smelled like power. From the outside, Whitehall looked like the kind of place poets would sell their souls to describe. A long sprawl of stone and symmetry along the Thames, carved balustrades, stained glass that caught the morning sun like gemstones, flags snapping in the wind, courtiers in silks the colour of wine and ash gliding across cobbled yards. It was the kind of building that whispered power lives here, taste lives here, cleanliness, of course, is implied. But then the doors closed behind you, and something else took over. Not immediately. The first few steps inside were tolerable. You smelled candle wax, old wood, maybe a whiff of herbs if someone important had just passed through. But then 3 steps, 5 steps, a turn, and the air thickened. And then it hit you. The smell wasn't just in the air, it was the air. You couldn't walk around it. You breathed it in with every shallow inhale. It clung to the walls, the velvet tapestries, the curls of fur sewn into collars. It hovered just below the line of speech, waiting for the moment someone opened their mouth too wide and tasted it. The smell of Whitehall was not dramatic. It wasn't a single thing. It was many small wrong things, braided together until they became a truth. Start with the heat, not fire body heat. 100 courtiers packed into a gallery with no cross-ventilation, the breath of cooks, guards, dancers, diplomats, men in doublets layered over linen, women in corsets sewn tight, gowns that clung like moss to a rotting log. The air didn't move, it steeped. Then add the sweat, not fresh sweat, old sweat, the kind that had time to think, to sit, to soak into fabric and dry there, layer upon layer. The kind of sweat that remembered arguments, hangovers, fear. It lived in the underarms of embroidered coats and the folds of lace collars. If you stood too close to anyone, especially after mid-morning, you smelled their politics. Now throw in the tallow, candles, everywhere. Whitehall ran on them, not the sweet-smelling beeswax used in chapels. Tallow rendered from animal fat was cheaper, accessible, efficient, and it smelled exactly like you'd expect a burning sheep to smell. Now imagine that, fused into the very ceiling after years of constant use. A cathedral of grease, and finally, the fabric, velvet, brocade, fur, all beautiful, all porous, all worn again and again without washing. They held memories, they held moisture, they held everything. The result, the palace didn't just smell used, it smelled crowded, even when it was empty. There's a particular cruelty in that. You'd think luxury would breathe, but it didn't. It suffocated. The wealthier the room, the heavier the air. The private quarters of nobles were lined with so much cushion, fur and gilt that it was like being trapped inside the lungs of someone else's perfume-soaked dream. You couldn't escape it. You could only manage it. That's why people wore Pomander's little metal orbs filled with herbs and spices, hung from belts or tucked into gloves. Some courtiers even stuffed oranges with cloves and wore them like citrus grenades, and not as decoration, as defense. It was a quiet war. Every day, you walked into a chamber and pretended you weren't dying to gag. You smiled, you bowed, you breathed shallowly, and you never, ever commented, because everyone knew, and no one was allowed to say it. Whitehall was, above all, a performance. Even the windows played their part. They were decorative, not functional. Tall, arched, filled with coloured glass. They let in light but not air. Curtains were heavy and rarely drawn back. Fresh air was a risk. Wind might disturb powdered wigs, or worse, carry in the plague. So the palace became a sealed system, a self-contained terrarium of rank. The air didn't refresh it rotated. What you exhaled on Tuesday might greet you again by Friday. And yet, this was normal. To them. They didn't smell it the way we would. Their noses were trained differently. Or more likely, they were numb. When everything and everyone around you carries a musk of unwashed flesh and crushed rosemary, you recalibrate, you stop noticing. Until, of course, someone particularly fresh arrives. And then you know. That's why Elizabeth's scent stood out. It didn't blend, it commanded. But even she couldn't mask the palace itself. She could perfume her body, but not the brick, not the furniture, not the memory of last week's feast, still floating somewhere near the rafters. Here's the thing no one tells you about royal palaces: they're not built for comfort. They're built for display and for grandeur and for echo and awe, but rarely for living and never for breathing. Whitehall wasn't a palace, it was a sweatbox, a place where luxury suffocated itself. The walls glittered, the floors shone, the ceilings soared, but the air pressed down. And that was the real trick. From the outside, you saw beauty. Inside, you felt it heavy, stale, unyielding. No wonder courtiers fainted during long audiences, not just from hunger or stress or too tight corsets, but because their lungs simply gave up. No one said so, of course. They called it swooning. It sounded more poetic than air-starved collapse. But here's the quiet horror: they chose this. They chose silk over circulation, brocade over breath, prestige over ease, and everyone played along, because that's what power does. It convinces you that the stink is worth it, that the gilded frame justifies the rot inside. So if you ever find yourself dreaming of courtly life feathers in your cap, goblet in hand, dancing in candlelight, remember someone, somewhere nearby, is steaming silently inside a triple-lined doublet, smelling faintly of anxiety and goat fat. And the worst part, so are you. There's something deliciously modern about a hot shower. The hiss of steam, the feeling of rinsing off the day, the quiet privacy of clean skin. But in Elizabethan England, stepping into a tub wasn't relaxing. It was suspicious, risky, potentially fatal, and because back then, water wasn't for the living. Water was for the dead. Let me explain. In the 16th century, people didn't associate bathing with health. Quite the opposite. They believed that hot water opened your pores, and that those open pores were basically a welcome mat for illness. If the wrong breeze hit you after a bath, it could slide in and kill you by breakfast. Even doctors said summon in robes the size of tents who spent more time bleeding their patients than curing them. According to the medical consensus of the day, water didn't clean the body. It weakened it. It softened the flesh. It diluted the humours. And nothing was more dangerous than diluted humours. Except, perhaps, smelling like you had them. So what did people do? They didn't wash. They perfumed. They dusted, brushed, aired, and stuffed themselves with herbs like mobile spice racks. Cleanliness wasn't about removing dirt. It was about convincing everyone you weren't dirty in the first place. And if you were tempted to bathe anyway, well, you might as well write your will. Public bathhouses had been all the rage a century earlier until the plague arrived and turned communal scrubbing into group funerals. After that, shared tubs became suspect. A man who soaked regularly was either a foreigner, a fool, or planning to die soon. Queen Elizabeth herself. She bathed occasionally. Her servants would heat water, sprinkle in dried rose petals and herbs, then lower her into a wooden tub like a cautious saint entering holy oil. But even then, it wasn't cleansing. It was ceremonial. A rare indulgence like eating off silver, or telling the truth at court. The rest of the time, she relied on linen cloths dipped in perfumed water to wipe her face, neck, and wrists. That was it. A wet rag and a prayer. And yet, no one questioned it. Because the alternative being known as someone who enjoyed bathing was worse. A man who bathed too often was seen as vain, soft, or morally suspect. A woman who bathed too often unstable, or worse, foreign. You see, the French were infamous for bathing more than once a month. and everyone knew where that kind of behaviour led scented love letters, open shirts, and revolutions. In England, real nobility didn't waste time with soap. They powdered their wigs, rubbed vinegar into their stockings, and changed their outer garments not because they were clean, but because they looked new. The body beneath that was private. That was personal. That was someone else's problem. And yet, despite all this, people still smelled. Of course they did. You can't perfume away fear. You can't powder over stress. And no amount of crushed clove can mask what 5 layers of wool do to a man during a political crisis. But instead of addressing it, they performed cleanliness like theatre, sprinkled lavender into shoes, burned rosemary in corners, held pomanders to their nose during long meetings and pretended it was elegance, not emergency. It got to the point where even water itself became a class marker. Peasants had to use it to wash clothes, cook food, even bathe children. But nobles avoided it. They had servants for washing and perfume for pretending, and the more you avoided water, the more refined you were seen. Bathing too much made you suspicious. Bathing not at all made you legendary. Even poets joined the party. One contemporary writer praised a nobleman for being as fragrant as a grove of myrtle, untouched by the vulgarity of soap, untouched indeed. The irony is brutal. They feared disease from water, but their avoidance of water may have caused just as much. Lice ran wild in hair never rinsed, fleas nested in beds never scrubbed, rashes, ulcers, and infections were treated not with soap, but with crushed pearls and prayers. The body became a battleground and not a clean one. There are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, of Elizabeth refusing to bathe during long stretches of illness, convinced that water would weaken her further. She relied instead on gloved hands soaked in rose oil and a face powdered into porcelain. And still, behind the fan and the makeup and the perfume, she sweated. She itched. She ached. Because no matter how powerful you are, the body always wins. It demands release. It demands care. And it doesn't care how royal you are. Which brings us to the real twist in all of this. The one group who did bathe regularly, the dead. Bodies were washed after death, prepared, anointed. Water was reserved for final cleansing, not for comfort. Not for vanity, but for transition. To bathe too often in life was to tempt the reaper, to act like a corpse before your time. So tonight, when you turn on the tap and the water comes hot, clean, and loyal when the steam rises and your muscles thank you, take a moment to be grateful. You live in a world where water is healing, where soap is simple, where bathing doesn't mean surrender. In Elizabeth's time, to bathe was to gamble. And if someone in court smelled freshly scrubbed, people didn't say, "You look well." They asked softly, cautiously, "Are you dying?" To understand Queen Elizabeth I, you have to understand one thing: she did not wear perfume. She armed herself with it. Perfume wasn't indulgence. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't even beauty. It was strategy, a battlefield tactic, a calculated fog of denial. And every morning that war began again. Her ladies-in-waiting knew the order by heart. No words were needed, only nods, glances, the silent choreography of routine. First came the oils, thick, warm, slow-moving, dabbed behind the ears, along the jaw, into the wrists. Musky, earthy, heavy. Then the sleeves were sewn, not just stitched, but embedded with little packets of clove, cinnamon, dried orange peel, crushed lavender, sachets so dense with scent they nearly outweighed the silk. Next came the powdered gloves, dusted with violet, sometimes with camphor, sometimes with amber griswale vomit, aged in the sun until it smelled of nothing except expensive indifference. And finally the cloud, a finishing veil of crushed resins and powdered flowers, flicked lightly across the bodice and hair, not applied with a spritz or a dab, but with a full fan sweep, like fog rolled in across a field of corpses. That was her defense. She didn't need swords or soldiers. She needed sillage, the ghost of her scent, left trailing behind long after she'd vanished into another room. You didn't forget Elizabeth. Your lungs didn't let you. And in a world where no one bathed, that made her unforgettable. But beneath that perfume there was something else. Something raw. Something very, very human. Because Elizabeth, for all her ceremony and myth, still had a body. It sweated. It strained. It betrayed her with age and illness, and she hated it for that. Perfume became the mask that never slipped. The truth is, she didn't want to smell like flowers. She wanted to smell like control. Each scent she wore was a layer of camouflage, not to hide from enemies, but to hide from mortality. From the people closest to her, from herself. A clean scent meant stability. A strong scent meant presence. A complex scent layered, strange, difficult to define meant sovereignty. And so she layered, every single day. Some days, she would reapply mid-afternoon, not because the scent had faded, but because the reality beneath had begun to leak through. A wig grown damp with stress. A collar turned sour from a too long counsel. A velvet bodice soaked at the seams with old heat. Reapplication was repair, reinforcement, repression. But here's the awful part: it didn't work. Not really. There are letters from foreign ambassadors describing her presence as dense. Not heavy with perfume, but dense, like trying to breathe through linen soaked in syrup. They described her as fragrant beyond diplomacy, which, in court speak, means you can't say she stinks, but she absolutely does. Just expensively. Behind closed doors, nobles whispered, not about what she said, but about how long her perfume stayed in a room after she left. Some said it lingered for hours. One man joked that her scent could outlast her policies. But no one said it to her face, because you didn't accuse the sun of being too bright. You didn't tell the queen her throne had a smell. And so the myth endured, that Elizabeth was more than a woman, that she was England itself elevated, sacred, eternal. But eternal things don't sweat. They don't blister under wigs or stain under silk. They don't have to reapply perfume every 3 hours because their corset traps the memory of last week's fever. Elizabeth did all of those things, and still, she kept layering, because she understood something vital. If the myth smelled sweet, no one would question the body underneath. That's why her perfume wasn't floral. It was feral, animal musk, resin, moulded citrus, crushed herbs, not one scent, but a strategy of deflection. If you couldn't describe her scent, you couldn't pin her down. If you couldn't pin her down, you couldn't challenge her. And so, each morning, she emerged not as a woman, but as a monument, dressed in steel-stitched gowns, breathing incense, trailing a wake of invisible soldiers in every whiff of amber and thyme. But even monuments were thin. There were days when the scent turned against her, when the warmth of the palace, unventilated, crowded, damp-melted the perfume into something cloying, when the gloves stuck to her fingers, when the wigs itched from within, when even she could smell the war she was losing. And still, she did not relent, because perfume, to Elizabeth, was not for pleasure. It was not for seduction. It was armor against judgment, against weakness, against the terrifying, uncontrollable fact of flesh. And so, the legend of her fragrance became part of statecraft. Visitors prepared for it, courtiers mimicked it, foreign wives tried to replicate it, but no one could fully match her. Because they didn't understand what she was masking. They didn't know that beneath the silken lace was a woman terrified of being seen as real, as flawed, as mortal. She couldn't afford to smell human. So she chose to smell imperial, and in that scent, she buried her fear. It's strange, isn't it? To think that one of the most powerful women in history fought her greatest war not on the battlefield, not in Parliament, not against Spain, but against her own odour. And maybe, in the end, she won. Because no one remembers how she smelled, only that she was unforgettable in portraits. Queen Elizabeth's gowns look weightless. They shimmer with embroidery, glint with pearls, cascade down in shapes that seem almost celestial, as if they were painted directly onto light, as if they never wrinkled, never sagged, never touched the body they adorned. But that is the lie, because Elizabeth's gowns weren't ethereal. They were heavy, dense, saturated with memory, and worst of all, they were never washed, not once. To wash a royal gown was unthinkable. Water could ruin the fabric, distort the stitching, bleach the colour, shrink the lining. So instead they were preserved, maintained, but never truly cleaned. Each day, a servant would lift the dress from its padded stand, shake it gently, turn it inside out, brush the seams, pat the underarms with cloth dipped in vinegar, hold it near a fire to let the warmth tease out the dampness, and then it would go back on, again, and again, and again. The dress remembered everything. It remembered the sweat. It remembered the tension of a long diplomatic dinner. It remembered how her hands clenched when a counsellor defied her, how her back stiffened during illness, how her shoulders drooped for just 1 minute before rising again. Those folds of velvet weren't just decoration. They were fabric journals, stitched from the silence of a woman who wasn't allowed to feel only to rule. And so, the gown did the feeling for her. It absorbed the heat of her frustration. It held the shiver of her uncertainty. It trapped the salt of her anxiety deep in the seams, where no one could see, but everyone could smell. Each time she wore it, she wore more than cloth. She wore accumulation, not just of scent, but of self. No one ever tells you how many times a queen wears the same dress. They change the collars, swap a brooch, add a string of pearls, and suddenly it's new. But beneath the brocade, it's still her dress, still soaked with days no one mentions. You could peel back the layers lace, lining, embroidery, and trace a kind of biography. This stain from a fever dream, that yellowing from hours beneath the weight of a wig, this stiffened edge from a panicked conversation with Parliament, that darkened fold from a day spent standing still, smiling, while the skin beneath broke down, and still no one said a word, because gowns were sacred, and queens were symbols, and symbols don't sweat, but they do. They always do. There's something tragic about a dress that can't be washed. It never gets to forget. Elizabeth's gowns became vessels not of fashion, but of memory and decay, and the more she wore them, the more they carried, not dirt but ghosts, invisible but undeniable. You could see it in the way her servants handled them, not with reverence, but with resignation. They knew what the fabric held. They felt it in the weight. They smelled it faintly when the wind shifted just right, and still they brushed. They patted. They whispered to one another in corners about which gown had weathered what day, which one had grown heavier since last season. Not heavier with jewels, heavier with something else. And this is the part no one teaches you in history books. Sometimes, a queen's power isn't in what she wears, it's in what she can't take off. Imagine it. You wake up. You put on the same gown you wore 3 days ago. You feel the familiarity of it, the way it hugs your waist, pinches your shoulder, crumples slightly at the hem. But you also feel the way it remembers you, not kindly. It holds a part of you you'd rather leave behind, but it's stitched in, and there's no water that can undo that, because water doesn't touch gowns like these. Only time does, and time is cruel. There are records of Elizabeth's dresses being passed down, gifted, inherited, but never washed. They simply move from one body to another, each new wearer adding their own chapter. By the end of her life, her wardrobe was a museum of grief. Gowns with weakened seams, collars yellowed from breath, sleeves stiff with repetition, and somewhere in a closet still dark, still there may yet hang a piece of fabric that once held her, still lined with clove, still faintly sharp with vinegar, still hers, not in beauty, but in residue. You see, fabric is honest in a way portraits never are. Paintings can lie, brush out the imperfections, brighten the eyes, smooth the skin, but a dress knows, a dress remembers. It remembers who sat in it, how long, with what pressure, in what mood, and how much effort it took to get up again. That is why Elizabeth never joked about her gowns. She used them, she respected them, but she never underestimated what they carried. And maybe, late at night, when no one was watching, she looked at the pile of sleeves and skirts waiting for the next day and thought, I have to put that on again. Not just the fabric, but the feeling, the weight of it, the closeness of it, the truth of it. And yet, she did. Every time. Because queens don't get to feel tired, but the gown does, and it never forgets. To kiss the hand of a queen was, for centuries, considered the height of honour, but no one in Elizabeth's court ever kissed her hand. They kissed her glove, a small distinction, but like everything at court, small distinctions were where truth went to die. At first glance, the queen's gloves were exquisite soft leather imported from Spain, sometimes lined with silk, sometimes stitched with gold thread so fine it looked like embroidery done in moonlight. They reached just above the wrist, tight enough to be elegant, loose enough to allow for the performance of gentility, a slow wave, a flick of the fingers, a gesture that said, "I acknowledge you," briefly, before you vanish again into irrelevance. But gloves, like gowns, were not just clothing. They were language. And Elizabeth's gloves, they spoke volumes. They whispered of lavender and bergamot. They carried hints of violet and civet, rose oil and clove. They left behind traces and doorknobs, parchment, cheeks like a signature that refused to be written down. They were not accessories. They were statements. And the statement was simple. You will never touch me. Not truly. Not skin to skin. Not with your lips, your fingers, or your power, because the glove was there to interrupt that, to keep the illusion intact. From the outside, you might believe the glove was about refinement, cleanliness, fashion, but you would be wrong. The glove was camouflage. You see, Elizabeth's hands were not pristine. They were dry, rough, spotted from age, sometimes cracked from cold, occasionally trembling from fatigue. They were the hands of a woman who had gripped too many documents, held too many grudges, and never held a bar of soap, because washing her hands, truly washing, was as rare as rain in court. Water, again, was a danger. So instead, she covered them, layered them, perfumed them, and let the world kiss the lie. It was a beautiful lie. You could almost believe it, until you noticed how long the glove stayed on, even in private, even at meals, even when she was exhausted and alone, and when the gloves wore out. They were replaced, not cleaned. A new pair would be brought in, drenched in rose oil, dusted with crushed iris root, massaged with pomade to keep the leather supple at least on the surface. Because the truth was never meant to seep through. There are accounts rare, careful accounts of courtiers catching a glimpse of her bare hands, not by accident, by necessity, signing something, reaching for a chalice, adjusting the edge of a tapestry, and they were startled, not because they were grotesque, but because they were real, and nothing at court was allowed to be real, especially not the Queen. So the gloves went back on, not just for beauty, but for distance. They became part of the ritual. When someone knelt to pay homage, the Queen would extend her gloved hand with a tilt of the wrist so perfect it looked rehearsed. And of course it was. Everything was. The courtier would bend, their lips would touch perfumed leather, they would inhale that rich, impossible scent, and they would believe just for a moment that they had touched something divine. But what they kissed was not her hand, not her flesh, not even her presence. They kissed what she wanted them to believe. They kissed a history of everything she needed to hide. You want to talk about irony, that glove, saturated in perfume, worn over a hand that hadn't felt water in weeks, carried more dirt than a garden spade, but it smelled like power, so it was power. And in a place where perception meant everything, that was enough. Even when the glove started to rot, yes, rot, leather, no matter how fine, absorbs what it touches, oils, sweat, heat, friction. Over time, the Queen's gloves grew stiff in the fingers, soft in the palm, darkened at the edges. They were soaked not just in scent, but in use. She held quills with them, held swords, held grudges. They became saturated with the residue of performance. And yet they remained beautiful, or rather, they were allowed to remain beautiful, because no one dared look too closely, and certainly no one dared smell too closely. The contradiction is staggering. Here were gloves meant to elevate her touch symbols of purity, grace, divine authority, and yet they were hiding hands that were raw, mortal, and silently breaking down. But the world didn't want Elizabeth the woman, it wanted the mask, so she gave it one, not over her face, over her fingertips, because touch is intimate, touch is dangerous, and for a queen, touch is a risk. Far better to be untouchable, to be kissed through a filter, to be felt only through the shape of something that doesn't bleed. And so, the glove became a kind of absolution. It let people pretend they had connected with her, and it let her avoid the mess of being connected to anyone. You have to admire it, in a way. It's brilliant, effortless, devastating. Because every time someone bent the knee and kissed her glove, they thought they were honouring a woman, but they weren't. They were honouring a boundary, a performance, a scent memory stitched into leather. And the Queen. She watched, she smiled, and she let them believe it was love. There's a stillness inside a royal wardrobe that feels almost sacred. Not the reverent silence of a church, something older, heavier, like the breathless hush of a sealed tomb. The room is dim, the air still, the walls padded. You don't hear footsteps here, only the soft hush of fabric brushing against itself, and if you breathe in slowly carefully you might catch it the faintest scent of old perfume, wool, cedar oil, and something deeper, something human, and no longer fresh. This is not a closet, it is a graveyard, a place where garments go not to rest but to wait. Each gown that hangs here once belonged to her, once wrapped around the body of a queen, once held the weight of a throne and the temperature of nerves just barely concealed beneath a powdered smile, but now they hang, shoulder to shoulder, fold to fold, still, quiet, remembering. You could open the door and find them lined up like mourners, velvet, brocade, silk, lace each one suspended in soft collapse, arms sloped, collars slouched, as if they had once stood proud and upright and now simply do not. And they do not forget, because Elizabeth's gowns, like her gloves, were not washed. Not truly, not soaked, not scrubbed, only brushed, only turned inside out and flapped gently in a window that never opened, only dusted with crushed rosemary and patted with cloths dipped in vinegar, which means the fabric never let go, of sweat, of oil, of grief. Each dress absorbed the days it was worn and kept them, not like memory, but like debt. This one held her during an ambush of tears, that one during a speech that nearly failed, another worn through a sickness no one was allowed to name, and one more hung quietly in the back, never worn again after a certain anniversary no one dared mention. They don't tell you this in museums. They show you the grandeur of the embroidery, the colour, the shimmer under lights, but they do not let you smell the past. They do not let you step close enough to sense the ache inside the seam, because these gowns were never just fabric. They were repositories, for tension, for fear, for secrets pressed down so hard they left creases that even time couldn't iron flat. Some gowns were worn in public scene, admired, recorded. Others lived only in private moments, in rooms where she sat alone, rooms where she stood too long, rooms where no one knocked unless they wanted to be dismissed. Those dresses, the quiet ones, are the heaviest. You can tell by the way they hang, as if the weight hasn't left them, as if they remember the body inside, as if the body is still there, not in shape, but in atmosphere. If ghosts are real, and who's to say they're not, they don't float in corridors rattling chains. They wait in linen, they cling to velvet, they gather in the folds of pleats and the scent of forgotten corners. A royal wardrobe is full of them. You walk into that room, and you don't just see clothing. You feel presence, not divine, not haunting, just present. As if someone left behind not their soul, but their tension. As if these gowns were soaked not just in perfume but in evidence. Because Elizabeth's dresses bore witness. They were there. When she was crowned. When she wept. When she punished. When she smiled too hard for too long, and no one noticed, except the seams. Imagine how many layers each gown held. Underskirt, petticoat, corset, bodice, sleeves, collar, ruff. Now imagine wearing those for 8 hours, or 12, or 16, while your back ached, while your skin bled beneath boning, while you nodded and ruled and endured, and when the day ended you didn't take it off and toss it in a basket. You had it unhooked, gently, hung carefully, and left it standing in a room where no one spoke above a whisper. That's not clothing, that's a diary, but one that never gets to close. Some gowns still held sachets in the sleeve, half-rotted bundles of dried herbs sewn into silk linings. Others still bore makeup smudges at the collar where a chin had pressed too hard. Others still had pins left in place, as if waiting to be worn again by someone who never came back. And in that stillness, the truth becomes unbearable. These gowns remembered her better than anyone did. Not in portrait, not in myth, but in texture, in temperature, in scent, and what they remembered wasn't always kind, because the body is not kind. It leaks, it ages, it betrays. But the dress never spoke, never judged, never told anyone about what it carried, only kept it. And now, long after the woman is gone, the fabric still hangs, not with grace, but with residue. You don't need a ghost story. You only need to stand very, very still in a room of old clothes and breathe, not deeply, just enough, because in that breath you will find it, the past, still clinging, still hanging, still waiting to be let go. But no one opens the window, not here, not in the closet of ghosts. At first glance, Queen Elizabeth looked immaculate, a vision of poise. Ruff perfectly flared, gown pressed and glistening like wet lacquer, cheeks powdered into softness, eyes lined with kohl so fine it might have been drawn with a whisper. She looked untouchable, unaging, unhuman. But Elizabeth wasn't untouched. She was layered, and beneath each of those layers was something darker. Start with the outermost, the gown, velvet, often, or brocade so thick it could stand on its own, heavily jewelled, beaded along the sleeves with pearls and garnets, impossibly stiff, glorious to the eye. But that velvet, it hadn't been washed in years. It soaked up heat like a hearthstone. It rubbed against the same places day after day, elbows, thighs, spine, and it never forgot a moment of it. Underneath that, the corset, not modern, hourglass corsets. No, this was bone and buckle, an iron-lace prison. It squeezed her ribs until breath became strategy, pressed her organs until digestion became unpredictable, left faint bruises on her back that never fully disappeared. Next layer linen, shift, petticoat, undergarments, all of it clinging to the skin, trapping heat, soaking sweat, turning warm and sour within an hour of being worn, and then finally her real skin. But even that wasn't really hers anymore, because it too was layered. First came the Ceres white lead, thick as plaster, patted on with damp cloth, painted across face, neck, and even hands. It gave the illusion of porcelain, of health, of divine blood untouched by mortality. But lead does not lie dormant. It seeps. And Elizabeth knew that better than anyone. Underneath the powder, her real skin rebelled. It peeled. It burned. It wept. There are whispers, always whispers, that she had open sores along her cheeks in her later years, tiny fissures where the lead had cracked the flesh, infections no one dared name aloud, and yet she powdered them anyway, layer upon layer, until they looked smooth from a distance, because closeness was not allowed, not with a queen, not when she was rotting from the outside in. She also wore rouge, though sparingly, just enough to counteract the deathly pallor, crushed cochineal, a pigment made from insects ground into powder, irony in a pot life drained to fake life, and still she was beautiful, in the way a preserved fruit is beautiful, glossed, fragrant, slightly soft at the edges, but anyone who looked too long could tell. Something was wrong. Her teeth had blackened. She smiled less. Her hair thinned beneath her wigs. The real skin beneath the lace collars grew blotched, and beneath it all, her body ached. She stood for hours. Her feet swelled. Her joints stiffened. She fainted once and caught quietly, politely. The room did not speak of it, because to speak of it would be to acknowledge what everyone feared. That the Queen was not eternal. She was aging, and not gracefully. She was decomposing politely, decoratively, with rose oil dabbed on her temples, with gloves soaked in violet, with perfumes that cost more than a servant's yearly wage. But the body beneath it was tired of pretending. Some days, the makeup would crack before lunch, the wig would slip, the perfume would go sour, and everyone in the room would smile tighter, breathe shallower, and pretend it wasn't happening. Because that's what court was, a ritual of denial. Denial that the air was thick, denial that the clothes itched, denial that the Queen, their queen, smelled increasingly like a shrine with something inside. It's a strange thing to witness beauty as an act of violence, not against others, but against the self. Because every day, Elizabeth suited up not just in splendour, but in suppression. She bound herself in silk and silence, pressed scent into the hollows of her neck, smeared lead across wounds that never had time to heal. She looked like a statue, and in many ways she was becoming one. But statues don't bleed. Elizabeth did. Her undergarments stained. Her body pulsed beneath the calm, and no one said a word. There's something heartbreaking about it. This woman who ruled armies, crushed revolts, outlasted monarchs and popes, and yet couldn't afford to let anyone see what her skin was becoming. So she covered it, every inch, with gold, with lace, with oil from whale intestines, with lies. And the court applauded because they wanted the myth, not the woman. They wanted Gloriana, the virgin queen, the star whose body refused to decay, even though, right in front of them, it already was. That's the truth no one paints, the one no artist dares capture. The slow, quiet disintegration of a woman too powerful to admit she was dying by inches, wrapped in satin, smiling, peeling underneath it all, beautiful and barely alive. Every morning, before the court stirred and before the sun warmed the stone of Whitehall, Queen Elizabeth began her transformation. It was not a casual process. It was not vanity. It was not even about looking beautiful. It was about becoming untouchable. The ritual began with silence. Her attendants, always women she trusted, or at least believed she could approach without speaking. The windows were shuttered, the mirrors covered. No one spoke of the day ahead. No one dared break the atmosphere, because what was about to happen wasn't makeup. It was alchemy, ceruse. That was the base, a thick, cold paste made of white lead and vinegar, beaten until it gleamed like liquid moonlight. Toxic, dense, magnificent. It was applied in slow, circular motions, using a soft cloth, or sometimes a sponge, first to the forehead, then the cheeks, then chin, then neck, layer after layer. It dried into something smooth, seamless, pale as bone. It did not matter what lay beneath. Blemish gone, rash concealed, fatigue erased, death delayed, visually, by at least one day. This was how Elizabeth controlled her image, not with words, but with powder. The whiter her skin, the more divine she seemed. Pale skin meant privilege. Pale skin meant power. Pale skin meant you never laboured under the sun. Pale skin meant you did not sweat like other people. Pale skin meant you were above it all bodily need, natural decay, even time. But lead is not a gentle ally. It doesn't just sit on the surface. It doesn't behave. It sinks, through pores, through wounds, through thinning skin, and over the years, Elizabeth's skin did thin. Wrinkles deepened, scars multiplied. The pox left tiny craters, so she applied more ceruse, more coverage, more control, until her real face wasn't just hidden, it was buried. And as the mask grew thicker, so did the whispers. Some said she never let anyone see her without it. Some said she even slept in it, or wept in it, her tears carving silent rivers down her painted cheeks. Some said her skin had begun to turn underneath, greying, peeling, cracking at the edges. And still she applied it, because to be queen was not to be seen. It was to be believed. And belief is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement, like a wall being repainted each day, just in case someone notices the cracks. That's what ceruse became, a wall, not against age, not against illness, but against disillusionment. Because if Elizabeth's face faltered, even slightly, so might her kingdom. That was the deal. She would sacrifice comfort, skin, and breathability in exchange for a face that frightened time into retreat. And it worked until it didn't. By her later years, the lead had begun to win, symptoms mounted, toothaches that made speaking difficult, tremors in her hands, hair thinning into wisps, occasional confusion, dizziness, fainting fits, all signs of lead poisoning, but no one dared name it, not out loud, not to her, because she was still beautiful, from 10 paces, in candlelight, if you didn't look too closely, but the mask had changed. It was no longer elegance, it was armour, it was denial, it was a desperate attempt to stay one layer ahead of death, and yet it was mesmerising. Visitors from other courts wrote home about her glow, how her face looked otherworldly, how her expression never changed. They did not know they were seeing a woman slowly encased in poison. The irony is sharp. Isn't it that the face meant to symbolize perfection was rotting beneath its own disguise? But still, she carried it, because the alternative exposure was worse. She could not show weakness. She could not show mortality. She could not show skin. Skin, after all, was too honest. It blushed. It flaked. It bled. It sagged. So she replaced it, painted on a new face every morning, layered on by women who knew what lay beneath but never said a word. A performance of power done in white, and white, in Elizabeth's time, was the colour of myth, of death, of something holy, of something gone. That's the quiet tragedy. Isn't it she didn't want to look alive? She wanted to look immortal, and for a while she did. But it came at a cost. The body beneath grew brittle, the breath came harder, the headaches pulsed stronger, and yet she sat, every morning, in front of a mirror she sometimes refused to look into, and let them make her divine again. Stroke by stroke, line by line, lie by lie, until finally, even her reflection forgot what she looked like, because the mask was never just on her skin, it was who she had become. There was a time when pale skin didn't just mean beauty, it meant status, it meant power, it meant you belonged to a class of people who never needed to toil, who never stepped into the sun unless it was to be admired beneath it. Pale skin meant someone else sweats for me. And no one in 16th century England wore that meaning more completely than Queen Elizabeth I. Her face wasn't just fair, it was blindingly white. A luminous, unearthly white that seemed to hover between the living and the divine. A white that wasn't born from genetics or good fortune, but from ritualized labour. Every morning, that shade was built from scratch. Ceruse white lead mixed with vinegar slathered across her face, neck, and sometimes even her hands. A full transformation. She didn't enhance her natural tone. She rejected it, because in her world, colour meant closeness to the body, and that was unacceptable. Skin, after all, is where the truth lives. It betrays you, with redness, blemishes, sweat, emotion. It pulses. It reacts. It ages. So Elizabeth erased hers. Whiteness became her defence against being seen. And to be fair, she wasn't alone. The court followed suit. Men and women alike powdered their faces, their hairlines, even the backs of their necks. The ideal English face looked less like a human and more like a porcelain mask pressed into flesh. To be pale was to be clean, above desire, above decay, above mortality. But whiteness, as it turned out, wasn't just colour, it was cover, a symbol of what was being denied. Because under that mask, the body kept pushing back. The skin beneath Elizabeth's makeup was not ethereal, it was raw, burned, blotched with sores, irritated from daily applications of lead, cracked from dryness, flaking in silence. She knew it. Her attendants knew it. And still, the powder kept coming. Because the alternative letting someone see her skin was worse. It wasn't just about hiding imperfections. It was about suppressing reality. A queen wasn't supposed to have a body. Not one that sweated, aged, ached. Certainly not one that bruised or bled. So she painted over it, again and again, until even mirrors began to lie. It's easy to romanticize the paleness of the past. We imagine candlelit ballrooms filled with elegant men and powdered women, their faces soft and glowing in the dim light. But what we forget is this, that glow wasn't health. It was chemical denial. They looked perfect because they were crumbling. And no one crumbled more beautifully than Elizabeth. The white on her face didn't just mute her features, it flattened her humanity. It made her myth. A woman who didn't age. A woman who didn't feel pain. A woman who, even on her worst days, looked untouched by the world she ruled. But the cost was steep. Lead poisoning seeped in through every application. Headaches, tremors, stomach pain, eventually even hair loss. Some historians suggest she began to lose clumps of hair in her later years, hiding the loss under increasingly elaborate wigs. Her teeth blackened, her memory faltered, but no one made the connection. Or if they did, they said nothing. Because she still looked perfect. From across the room, if you didn't stare too hard, if you didn't get too close. And that was the point. Closeness was a threat. Proximity was a risk. Whiteness created distance. It was her shield, her space, her no-entry zone. To be pale was to be above reproach, above touch, above consequence. But what happens when denial hardens into a way of life, when you no longer choose to wear the mask because the mask has become you? Elizabeth crossed that line long ago. By the end of her reign, her face was a performance of itself. Her pale cheeks no longer meant beauty. They meant survival. Because the moment she stopped, she ever let the world see her without it, the spell would break. The myth would collapse. The image would flicker. The truth would bloom, red and sweating across her cheeks. And so she continued, day after day, applying white lead with steady hands, even when it burned, even when it hurt, even when she no longer liked what she saw, only what she needed to see. Because being queen wasn't about honesty, it was about constancy. And pale was constant, reliable, predictable, even as her body weakened, even as her mind grew heavy with years, even as her courtiers whispered behind fans that she no longer quite looked alive. She remained pale, unblinking, immovable, because whiteness was not just an aesthetic. It was her final act of defiance. She would not give in to age. She would not yield to nature. She would not admit the truth, even as it blistered beneath the surface. Because to do that would mean admitting she was just a woman. And by then, no one wanted her to be. Not even herself. There were days when the perfume couldn't keep up. Days when the heat pressed down on the palace like a wet blanket, thickening the air until it felt less like something to breathe and more like something to endure. Summer in Whitehall wasn't golden, it was gummy. Windows stayed shut, curtains trapped the warmth, bodies multiplied in every hallway, fanning themselves with lace and lies. And on those days, even the Queen began to melt, not visibly, never publicly, but quietly, relentlessly, from the inside out. It always began in the seams, the places no one could see, where corset met waist, where shift met spine, where silk met skin and the two began to fuse. The perfume once so strong, so sovereign started to curve, first sweet, then cloying, then off, because perfume, no matter how noble, was still a body's prisoner. Ambergris, musk, crushed herbs, whale spit aged in the sun. These things could only delay what the flesh eventually revealed, and flesh, when trapped too long, speaks. Even Elizabeth couldn't silence it. That day, perhaps in July or August. No one dares mark it precisely, the scent changed. It didn't vanish. It twisted. What had once been commanding now felt desperate. What had once floated behind her like a halo now clung like fear. A diplomat noticed it first. He leaned in to kiss her gloved hand and recoiled just slightly, just imperceptibly, just enough. He later described it in a letter. The air was thick, as though it had been perfumed too late. Too late. That was the problem. The heat had arrived before the attendants could repowder her, before fresh gloves could be drawn from cedar-lined boxes, before sleeves could be restuffed with mint and thyme, before scent could perform its magic. And so the truth leaked out, from under her arms, from behind her knees, from the base of her neck where the wig strap rested, from the faint tremble in her fingers as she waved. She was still dressed like a goddess, still powdered into paleness, still ringed in gold and draped in foreign silk, but the room no longer believed. Because smell is primal, it bypasses reason. It doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't care who wears the crown. On that day, the perfume failed, and the court held its breath literally. No one spoke of it. Of course not. To mention it would be treason of the highest order. To suggest the Queen had a body, a warm, pulsing, leaking body, a human body. Instead, fans fluttered. Sleeves were lifted discreetly to faces. Attendants scurried with sachets and citrus peels, and conversations grew shorter, tighter, more vertical. The musicians played louder, because even music was safer than scent. But it was too late. Once you've smelled the truth, you can't unsmell it. That's the thing no one tells you about myth. It doesn't end in flames. It ends in humidity. The Queen, to her credit, said nothing. She held her posture. She maintained her mask. But she knew. There's a particular kind of panic that lives just beneath a perfume smile when you realize your disguise is cracking and the body beneath is about to make itself known. That day, her perfume betrayed her. Or perhaps it finally told the truth, because the scent didn't vanish. It simply gave up. It stopped pretending. It stopped covering. It mixed. And the result was something intimate and horrifying. A scent that was not perfume, not sweat, not illness, but a terrible, familiar mix of all three. It smelled like trying, and nothing is more human than that. Afterward, the room was aired, the tapestries shaken, the gowns burned incense in their folds. The Queen was bathed not in water, of course, but in layers of correction, fresh lead paste, fresh gloves, fresh smile. But the damage was done, not to her reputation. No one spoke ill, no one would dare, but to the illusion, the one that hovered above her like a crown of air. That day, it sank. And something shifted in the court, not visibly, but in the way people approached, in the way they smiled a little longer before leaning in the way they began to bring their own pomanders to audiences, just in case, because once perfume fails, people don't forget. The scent lives in memory, in fabric, in air. Even now, centuries later, when no molecule remains, the idea lingers. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, the untouchable icon, had a moment where her scent turned mortal, where fragrance lost the war, and in that moment, for the first time in decades, people smelled her. Not the symbol, not the monarchy, not the myth, her, and they never quite forgave her for it. Not openly, but in how they remembered her. Not as the Queen who ruled for 44 years, but as the Queen whose perfume, once, for one long summer afternoon lost. She didn't need to enter the room to be noticed. People sensed her arrival in their lungs, not through footsteps, not through sound, but through scent. A sharp twist of clove, a whisper of crushed jasmine, something musky, foreign, and unplaceable. And suddenly, conversation slowed, chairs were adjusted, spines straightened, hearts ticked just a little faster, because she was near, and her scent had arrived first. This was no accident. Elizabeth didn't just wear perfume, she deployed it. Like a weapon, like a cavalry charge, like a blade with no edge, only radius. Her scent radiated outward in waves, touching noses before words touched ears, and the message it carried was simple: I am here. You will obey. It was carefully crafted and not sweet, not floral, not faint, but complex, layered, dangerous, a blend of musk from deer glands, ambergris, aged until it smelled like salt and inevitability, a foundation of cedar and civet, and just enough spice cinnamon perhaps to sting if you inhaled too deeply. It didn't invite, it infiltrated. No one said this aloud. Of course, not in court, but the effect was clear. Men froze when it hit them. Women blinked, slowly. Silence spread like spilled oil. It was more than a smell. It was an atmosphere, a field of power that surrounded her body in an invisible, inescapable halo. And once you stepped inside it, you were no longer in charge. People bowed faster in her presence, not because of etiquette, but because of instinct. Their bodies sensed they were prey, even before their minds caught up. This was how she ruled, not with volume, not with violence, but with preemptive possession. Before a word was spoken, before a hand was raised, before she even crossed the threshold, you already belonged to her, because she had entered you through your nose, down your throat, into your breath, and the body does not argue with what it inhales. She didn't need a crown to be recognized. Her perfume was her standard, her advance guard, her invisible sword. No one else smelled like her. No one was allowed to. In fact, the court was carefully managed to ensure it. Servants avoided using the same oils. Ladies in waiting were given precise scent guidelines. If someone showed up smelling too similar, they were quietly, immediately corrected. Because the Queen's scent was singular. It was her weapon, her claim, her signature in the air. And to mimic it, intentionally or not, was to commit olfactory treason. Visitors from abroad wrote of it in their reports. She arrived with a storm of scent that quieted the room before her voice did. There is no escaping her presence, even with your back turned. One even called it the pressure of roses under threat. which is perhaps the most elegant way to describe how terrifying her fragrance could be. Because it wasn't pleasant. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to conquer. And on days when her body weakened, when her voice faltered, or her joints ached, she leaned into it even harder. More perfume, more density, more fog, as if to say, I may bleed beneath this gown, but you'll never smell the wound. Her scent filled council chambers before decisions were made, filled chapels before prayers were spoken, clung to diplomatic rooms long after treaties were signed. Sometimes, the scent outlasted the memory. People remembered how it felt to smell her, long after they forgot what she said. It became her mythology. Children in the palace whispered that you could follow her scent through the halls, that it never truly left, that it drifted, slow and coiled, like a ghost without a name. Some claimed it stayed trapped in the velvet of chairs, in the creases of tapestries, in the cracks of the floor. And maybe it did, because scent, more than sight or sound, lingers. It survives. It burrows. It waits. And that was Elizabeth's genius. She didn't just rule over time. She ruled over presence. Even when she wasn't there, she was. Even when she was gone, you knew she had been. That's how empires work. Not by armies, not by laws, but by imprint. And what is perfume, if not imprint made breathable? It's strange to think how many decisions were made, how many alliances were forged, how many betrayals swallowed while under the influence of a queen-scented orbit. Strange and inevitable, because once you'd smelled her, you were changed. You had submitted, whether you knew it or not, and once you'd submitted, you obeyed. This is what no portrait can tell you, what no statue dares capture, that Elizabeth's most powerful weapon was invisible, weightless, and absolutely undeniable. Her scent didn't just announce her, it defeated you, before she even spoke. And then she smiled. Let's get one thing out of the way: everyone in Elizabethan England stank. The Queen, the courtiers, the cooks, the clerks, the jesters, the poets who wrote about silk-clad necks and rose-lipped whispers, they stank too. It was a world built on elegantly arranged, richly perfumed, but rot nonetheless. And yet, not all stink was created equal. In the grand ecosystem of odour, there was a hierarchy, a scent-based caste system, an invisible rulebook written directly into the air, because some people smelled bad and were punished, others smelled worse and were applauded. Take the nobleman who wore the same doublet for 6 months. He'd never washed it, of course. That would ruin the embroidery. But he did sprinkle it with crushed cloves and rub the collar with bay leaf paste. When he walked past, people bowed, not because he smelled good, but because he smelled expensive. Now take the washerwoman who carried fresh laundry uphill every morning. She bathed her hands in the river, used ash soap, scrubbed her skin raw, but she still reeked of sweat and wood smoke and the meat she boiled the night before. And for that, she was called filthy, even by men who hadn't seen soap since the last coronation. This is how it worked. The poor stank because they worked. The rich stank because they could afford not to. And the Queen, she was above the scale entirely. Her scent was curated, sculpted, weaponized, but under it, yes, beneath all that resin and musk she stank too. Just differently. Her odour wasn't from the forge. It wasn't from childbirth or livestock or river mud. It was from fear, from velvet, from illness concealed by powder. But nobody said a word, because her stink wore a crown. This is the great joke of history. Odour became class. It told you who had power, who deserved forgiveness, who got to walk through a crowded court hall without triggering a single flinch even if they were steaming like a meat pie in August. Because if your smell came from crushed ambergris and civet oil, you were exotic. If it came from feet and old broth, you were disgusting. Same saturation, different perfume. One got a poem, the other got a warning. Elizabeth understood this better than anyone. She turned it into strategy. The richer her scent, the more tolerated her presence. Even when her body ached, even when the sores beneath her makeup seeped quietly onto linen, even when she hadn't changed her underdress in 5 days. Because the perfume said otherwise. It said, look away. Everything is fine. And people did. They always do when royalty smells like roses boiled in whale spit. Even the poor played along. They knew their place in the scent hierarchy. That's why peasants stuffed lavender in their boots on holy days, why fishmongers carried sprigs of mint in their pockets, why midwives chewed cloves when attending births, not to protect the baby, but to protect their dignity. Because to smell good was to be seen as more, and to smell bad, that meant you were already guilty of poverty, of failure, of being too close to reality. Let's not forget the most dangerous thing you could smell like was human, raw, honest, unmasked. So everyone pretended, drenched themselves in whatever they could find, piss-scented vinegar, perfumed gloves passed down from a cousin, orange peels stuffed under their armpits. It was all theatre, a desperate ballet of aroma. And the closer you got to the Queen, the more important your scent became. There were stories of courtiers denied entry to a private audience, not because they looked dishevelled, but because they forgot to dab clove oil behind their ears. The guards didn't even blink. You'll come back when you smell like you matter. Even sickness had rules. A nobleman dying of consumption still wore rosewater. A farmer with a chest infection, thrown out of church for stinking like death. The irony was suffocating. People who died in palaces were carried out under silk sheets still leaking, still festering, but the corridor was lined with incense. Because heaven forbid you smelled the truth on your way to breakfast. And this wasn't just about perfume. It was about permission. Who had the right to be repulsive without consequence, and who had to bleach themselves invisible just to survive? Elizabeth Court didn't ask those questions. It wore the answers like lace. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not that people stank, but that some stinks were sacred. That if your odour came in a gold-laced bottle, it wasn't a problem. It was fashion. It was ritual. It was your brand. There were times rare, whispered, when the Queen's scent overwhelmed even her most loyal attendants. When the heat got too high, when the layers refused to breathe, when her body insisted on reminding the room that it still existed. And still, they bowed. Still, they kissed her glove. Still, they praised her radiance, because no one dared name the smell. They just promoted it. That's how scent worked in the 16th century. Not as reality, but as marketing. And if you could market your stink well enough, you could rule the world. So tonight, as you tuck yourself beneath your clean sheets, your skin freshly scrubbed, your pillow faintly smelling of laundry and memory remember in Elizabeth's court, nobody smelled good. They just smelled like who they were allowed to be. Every morning at Whitehall, the curtain rose, not in the throne room, not in the chapel, but in the Queen's private chambers. There, beneath the quiet rustle of linen and the low hiss of scented cloth being wrung out, the performance began. It wasn't a bath. It wasn't a wash. It was a ritual. A damp linen cloth, just one dipped in a bowl of rosewater and vinegar, pressed gently along the face, across the temples, down the neck, a swift stroke behind each ear. There. The audience unseen but imagined could now exhale. The Queen was clean. Of course, she wasn't. Not really. But that was never the point. Cleanliness, in Elizabeth's world, was not about water. It was about optics, control, a choreography of illusion. The handmaidens moved in silence, each gesture practiced, delicate, reverent. A brush stroke here, a dab of perfume there, a sachet sewn invisibly into a hem. It was a stage without applause, and the Queen, she was both actress and director. She knew exactly how long to sit, how still to stay. She knew the lines no, not too much powder. Yes, that one lavender. Again, the wrists. And when it was over, she stood, transformed, not washed, not refreshed, but prepared for an audience, for a world that believed her body did not sweat, did not itch, did not decay like theirs. It was the ultimate costume, but beneath it, the truth hummed quietly. No one here is clean, only convincing. Even the servants, whose job was to clean the Queen, performed their own cleanliness. They brushed their aprons with lemon peel, tied rosemary to their waists, rubbed their hands with vinegar before entering the room not to kill germs, but to kill the impression of proximity. Everyone smelled like effort. Effort not to reek. Effort not to remind others that they, too, were made of meat. The irony was thick enough to bottle, because the court loved purity, obsessed over it, celebrated it in poems, in sermons, in lace and linen and imported oils. But no one chased actual cleanliness, just its shadow. The illusion that you were cleaner than the person beside you, that you were composed, crisp, composed of something higher. And so the daily drama unfolded. The nobleman with tallow-soaked cuffs laughed at the peasant who smelled like sheep. The lady with onion on her breath sneered at the maid who forgot her pomander. The queen powdered her neck raw, then received praise for looking heaven-touched. And not one of them had truly touched water that week. It was all performance, and no one could break character, because to break was to fall, to sweat, to stink, to be ordinary, and in court. Being ordinary was more dangerous than treason. There were moments, small ones, when the mask slipped, when a servant caught a whiff of reality beneath a noblewoman's ruff, when a glove came off and revealed fingers yellowed at the tips, when a sachet failed to cover the scent of fever. And in those moments, the room paused, not with horror, but with recognition, the way an audience hushes when an actor forgets a line. And then, without comment, the performance resumed. Because what choice was there? No one wanted the truth. They wanted the version that smelled like lavender, even if it was fake, especially if it was fake. The Queen understood this. She never claimed to be pure. She simply acted as if she were better than anyone. And that, in the end, was her genius. Not to cleanse herself, but to choreograph the appearance of cleanliness so convincingly that everyone else copied her. Not out of admiration, but out of survival. Because in that court, the cleanest people weren't those who bathed. They were those who lied best, with perfume, with powdered gloves, with careful angles in candlelight. Cleanliness was no longer hygiene, it was politics. An invisible performance staged at the level of scent, and like any theatre, it had rules. Rule 1, never acknowledge the body. Rule 2, if it smells, mask it. If it leaks, cover it. If it itches, ignore it. Rule 3, if someone breaks the rule, sweats in public, gasps for air, pulls at a collar too tightly bound, look away. Silence was part of the show, because to comment was to confess. And no one in court could afford to admit they were playing pretend, especially not the Queen. She played hardest of all, wrapped in velvet, painted in lead, breathing through linen soaked in amber. You'd think it was armour, but it was just costume, worn down, redone. A dress rehearsal for a version of herself the world demanded. A queen who didn't smell like fear, who didn't have a pulse, who didn't decay. And each day she pulled it off, the world clapped silently, reverently, from behind scented fans. Not for who she was, but for how well she faked being clean. They never wrote the histories. They weren't in the portraits. They didn't sign the proclamations or declare wars or sit for oil paintings with mottos inscribed above their heads. But they knew. The servants knew. Not in theory, not by rumour, but in the way that only those who clean up after power understand it intimately, physically, one sleeve at a time. They knew what the Queen's favourite perfume smelled like after it had mixed with a fevered night. They knew which gown had been worn through a difficult audience, the one with the inner lining stiff with nervous sweat, just behind the left shoulder. They knew the colour of her underclothes on the days she coughed too hard, the scent of her hands when she skipped the vinegar rinse, the way her bodice creaked when she was holding back grief. They weren't guessing. They were there, and they said nothing. Not because they didn't have thoughts, not because they didn't see, but because they knew something deeper. Everyone needs a dream to survive, and theirs was that their queen was made of roses. So they played along. They brushed the dresses without flinching. They dabbed perfume onto gloves already saturated with weeks of hand residue. They re-sewed sachets into sleeves so pungent with skin that they practically sighed when touched. And they did it all gently, because to rush was disrespect. To gag was rebellion. To name the smell was to tear a hole in the illusion they all needed to get through the day. The illusion that royalty smelled better, lived better, was better, but deep down, they knew. The Queen's body wasn't so different. It aged, it ached. It betrayed her with sudden spasms and long, slow decay. And in the privacy of those dressing chambers, where no dukes were watching, the only people who saw her fully were the ones no one ever looked at. The women who laced her corsets, the men who aired her gowns, the hands that packed clove into her glove linings. They were never thanked, rarely acknowledged, but always present. They knew which gloves to avoid, the ones with the worst stiffness, the rankest scent deep in the seams. They knew how to pin her hair so the sores at the nape of her neck wouldn't show. They knew which part of her shoulder had rubbed raw under the weight of brocade, and yet they never spoke of it. Not to each other, not to their children, not even to themselves in the quiet of the laundry room, because silence was their loyalty, and more than that, it was their dignity. It was the only thing they had that couldn't be taken or taxed or ordered. To remain silent in the face of truth wasn't cowardice, it was compassion. Because if they exposed the Queen, what would be left? Another broken body? No. They chose to protect the version of her that the world needed to believe in, the one who smelled like power, who shimmered in candlelight, who floated into a room in a cloud of cloven command. Even if they knew she sometimes winced when standing, even if they had washed the linen that bore the imprint of a restless, sweating night. They folded those truths into corners, pressed them under the weight of lavender and prayer, let them dissolve into the seams of history like powder into silk. Because what was the alternative to live in a world where even the Queen was breakable, to admit that no one, not even the one draped in gold, could escape the human mess beneath? No. That would be unbearable. So they preserved the fantasy. And in doing so, they preserved a piece of themselves. Because every servant, no matter how low, carries a secret hope that their labour means something, that their silence is a kind of offering, that they, too, belong to the myth. And maybe they did. Maybe the Queen's beauty was built not from porcelain and pearls, but from the hands that never let the truth show. They knew which linens to retire, which perfumes to layer over a certain kind of illness, which nights to change the sheets without asking questions. They knew she was rotting, and they still treated her like a miracle. Not because she deserved it, but because they needed someone to be a miracle, even just for a moment, even just in passing, even just to help them keep going. And perhaps, in return, the Queen gave them something too. Not money, not favour, not safety, but the chance to say quietly to themselves, I was there, I saw, and I held the line. In a world where everyone else performed for applause, the servants performed for nothing, and yet their roles were the most vital, because they carried the weight of the truth and chose, deliberately, to keep it sacred. Not for her, for all of them. Because if you lose the myth, you lose the world. And sometimes, survival is just agreeing to keep the dream alive, even when you're the one doing the laundry. The day she bathed was marked like an eclipse. Not on calendars, not in public, but in the hush that settled over her chambers like dust before rain. Because the Queen did not bathe often, and when she did, the palace seemed to pause, as if everyone knew something delicate, dangerous, and vaguely sacred was about to occur. It was never spontaneous. It began hours earlier, with preparations that resembled religious ceremony more than hygiene. The room had to be warmed, not just heated, warmed. The hearth was lit, the windows shut tight, thick curtains drawn to mute the light into something soft and indirect. Servants moved with the slowness of people preparing a shrine. They brought in bowls of dried herbs, rosemary, mint, marigold, lavender. They tied the herbs into little bundles no bigger than a hand and dropped them into the water, letting the scent bloom first before heat followed. The tub itself was made of wood, lined in tin. It creaked faintly as it filled. The sound gentle splashes. Soft hisses was the only sound in the room for a while. No one spoke above a whisper. Some didn't speak at all, because this wasn't just about cleansing. It was about restoration, of image, of ritual, of something too worn down to name. And yet, no one expected her to emerge clean, only reassembled. When Elizabeth entered, she wore a robe, her face already powdered, her hair already pinned. The bath was never about removing anything. It was about adding silence. She disrobed without ceremony. There were no mirrors. That was intentional. The body, after all, was never invited to the myth, not in its truest form. Into the water she went slowly, breath held, like someone descending into a forgotten sea. The steam curled around her face. The scent rose with its harp, green, floral, faintly medicinal, like a promise someone forgot to keep. And then she sat, still, back straight, hands resting at her sides or gently on her knees, eyes open, staring not at anything, but into something. This was not relaxation. This was occupation, a space she had to inhabit, Even here, even now. The bathwater touched her skin but did not touch her, because the water was not there to clean. It was there to convince her body it had been tended to, convince her mind that effort had been made, convince the people around her that she was still a woman who knew what freshness meant. But everyone knew better. They didn't call it a bath. Not truly. They didn't scrub. They didn't soak. They didn't touch her feet, her back, her thighs. They dabbed. They patted. They wrung cloths gently and passed them over arms already powdered, legs already stiff. It was like touching a statue and pretending it sighed. Sometimes she closed her eyes. Sometimes she didn't. But always, there was distance. The tub was warm. The room was quiet. But her body did not relax, because to relax would mean admitting how tightly wound she had been, and that was more dangerous than grime. This was not an act of cleansing. It was a reaffirmation that she still existed in ritual, that she still had people who would prepare and pour and powder, that she could still sit bare, surrounded by silence and not break. But the older she got, the harder it became. The water no longer soothed. It stung. Small cuts, dry patches, unseen bruises from corsets too tight and gowns too stiff. The heat no longer comforted. It drained, and the scent, once calming, now felt artificial, like a memory someone else had worn too long. She didn't linger. 15 minutes, perhaps, 20 on better days, any longer, and the water began to coolen with it. Her resolve. When she rose, it was slow, not because she wanted to savour it, but because rising too quickly made the room spin. A cloth was offered. She took it without speaking. Then came the rewrapping, the repowdering, the resealing of what had briefly softly opened, and when she emerged, she was whole again, not fresh, not new, but unquestioned, which, in court, mattered more. No one asked how the bath felt. No one cared if her skin ached or her muscles groaned the next day. They only cared that it happened, that the Queen had bathed, that the illusion held, that the performance had been completed. It's easy to forget this, centuries later. To imagine that a royal bath was luxurious, sensual, rich in marble and rose petals. But that's not what this was. This was a morning ritual for comfort, an attempt to summon back youth through warm water and fading herbs, and each year it worked a little less. Each year, the bath was shallower, the silence heavier, the smell more melancholy, because even myths, when soaked long enough, begin to soften at the edges. And Elizabeth, she had been soaking in hers for decades. It's easy to forget there was a body beneath the myth, a body that woke up stiff, that limped from bed to dressing chair, that winced when laces pulled too tight and teeth clenched too hard. But Queen Elizabeth had a body, and it betrayed her daily. Of course, no one said it that way. The court didn't talk about the Queen's body. They spoke of her aura, her presence, her radiance, but not her skin, not her joints, not the crack that sometimes appeared near her lip where the lead paint had dried too fast, not the raw patches on her scalp beneath the powdered wig. They didn't talk about the shaking in her hand when she lifted a goblet, or the heaviness in her breath after climbing 5 stone steps, or the way she sat more slowly, more deliberately, as the years crept in like mildew behind drapery. They weren't allowed to see that. She didn't allow herself to show it. But it was there. Her body had been her enemy since the beginning, too female to rule, too fertile to trust, too soft to lead an empire of men. So she turned it into something else. She locked it down, wrapped it in silk, squeezed it into corsets and ceremonial robes and scripts written by men in Latin, and for a while it obeyed. She danced, she dazzled, she stood tall while kings fell and countries folded, but behind the scenes it strained, bit by bit, quietly. Her gums bled, her appetite thinned, her period stopped or maybe never came again. No one dared to say. And under all the perfume and powder and gloved performance, her body began to ask a dangerous question. How much longer can we keep this up? Because no matter how divine she appeared, she still had nerves, muscle, bone, and those things get tired, especially when no one is allowed to speak their name. She was a queen, but also a woman in a world where womanhood was both weapon and weakness, expected to glow, but not sweat, to lead, but not bleed, to rule, but not remind anyone that she had breasts and hips, and sometimes pain in places she could not explain. So she locked it all down, not just in public, in private too. The body became a thing to be managed, a threat to be neutralized. Her corset wasn't just fashion, it was a cage, not just for her waist, but for everything beneath it, the emotion, the fatigue, the fragility. And like many women of her age, of any age, she learned to live inside it, to smile through inflammation, to stand through cramps, to host ambassadors while her skin itched under 7 layers of wool and lace. This was not unique. The women who served her, who dressed her, watched her, held her secrets, knew this pain, too. They wore their own cages. They bled into cloth and said nothing. They birthed children in silence. They buried them without screaming. They knew that their bodies were liabilities, things to be hidden, suppressed, repackaged as virtue. And Elizabeth, even at the top of the world, wasn't spared. Her body didn't care about crowns. It swelled, it sagged, it smelled. It reminded her, day after day, that no matter how high she climbed, she was still made of flesh. There's a particular kind of grief in that. Not dramatic, not explosive, just slow. The grief of living in something that once obeyed and no longer does, of waking up in skin that doesn't fit the myth. And yet, she carried on. Because what else was there? She couldn't stop being queen. She couldn't take a day off from being symbol, icon, untouchable deity in pearls. So she did what women have always done. She endured. She swallowed it. She tucked it in. She smiled while her back burned and her heels blistered and her wig dug deep into her skull. And at night, when the world was quiet, she undressed layer by layer, not into comfort, but into truth. The robe fell away, the gown lifted, the corset unlaced, and what remained a woman, still breathing, still fighting, still aching in places no one had ever kissed. That was her rebellion. Not war, not conquest, not speeches, but survival. Surviving in a body she was never allowed to own, carrying a nation on skin she was expected to erase. So when you imagine her sitting on the throne, face powdered into marble, spine straight as a sword, remember this: her knees hurt. Her bladder was full, her scalp was tender, her belly was bloated, her ribs ached from the armor she wore daily. But she sat there anyway, because sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is stay upright in a body trying to collapse. And in that, Elizabeth wasn't alone. She was every woman who's ever bled silently, smiled professionally, and carried on. Every woman who has ever whispered to herself, just get through today. You leave the palace. You step out into the air, real air, for the first time in hours. There's a breeze. It should feel clean. It should feel like escape. And yet you pause, because something has come with you. It's not visible. It's not loud, but it's there. A smell. Not strong. Not immediate. Just persistent. It clings to your sleeves. It curls behind your ears. It lingers in the folds of your collar. The palace didn't stay behind. It followed you. This is the thing no one warns you about. Whitehall doesn't end at the gates. It coats you, in musk, in dust, in memory. You carry it home. It's in your hair, on your skin. Even after you undress, it stays. The smell of velvet that's never been cleaned, the ghost of tallow smoke, the sharp sweetness of clove and sweat locked in a room too long, even the silence of power that, too, has a scent. You don't notice it right away, but as the hours pass alone far from court, you begin to feel it. A faint oiliness at your temples, a dry tang in your throat, the shadow of perfume under your nails, and with it, the realization you didn't just witness the machine of monarchy. You breathed it in. It's now inside you. That's how Whitehall works. It gets into the lining, not just of clothes of people. It settles into the folds of your habits, the weight of your posture, the way you smile too tightly, laugh too quietly, hesitate before you speak even after you've gone. Because power is not something you visit. It's something that visits you back. Elizabeth understood this. She didn't just want to be remembered. She wanted to stay on you. Long after her voice faded, long after the dress was folded, long after the glove was kissed and returned, her scent was designed to haunt. And it did. You could smell it in your chambers later. On your pillow, In the hollow of your wrist where you briefly brushed her sleeve, it made you question yourself. How close had you really been? How much had she seen? How much of her reality had touched you without permission? Because proximity to royalty always comes with cost, not in coin, but in aftertaste. It's the price of access. You walk out thinking you're free. But hours later, as you try to sleep, there's still something in the air. Something too rich, too warm, too carefully constructed. It reminds you of being watched, of having to measure your breath, your bow, your words. It reminds you of her, not the woman, not the monarch, the phenomenon, the one who layered herself in scent so thick it outlived conversation, the one who controlled rooms with perfume and posture, the one who refused to vanish by design. And you realize the palace doesn't trap you with stone. It soaks into your skin. It changes how you walk, how you hold your hands, how you judge the silence in your own home. Because compared to court, the world is too quiet, too ordinary, too honest. No one here is pretending to be eternal. No one smells like roses and fear. And you miss it. A little. You miss the pageantry, the weight of ritual, the comfort of being told exactly who you are by the way someone doesn't look at you. But most of all, you miss the scent, because it told you what mattered. And now, without it, you feel unmoored. You try to wash it off, but the soap doesn't reach it, because it isn't just on your skin. It's in your memory, in your sense of place, in the phantom twitch at your wrist when someone says your grace, even though they mean nothing by it. You carry it like a bruise that doesn't fade, and Elizabeth, she planned it that way. That's what power is, not just presence, but residue. The Queen knew she couldn't live forever, but she could linger, not in stories, not just in books, but in you, in every person who entered her orbit and left with the faintest trace of her on their coat. She didn't want legacy. She wanted infiltration, to be a scent no one could name, a warmth no one could place, a tension no one could shake, and it worked. Because now, even as you stand in the open air, beneath a wide, forgiving sky, she's still with you. Not in sight, not in sound, but in scent. A queen who walked through the world leaving fingerprints no one could dust for only breathe. And the strange thing, you don't want it to go away. Because what does it mean when the smell finally fades? It means you were never that close to begin with. Start with the glove. It smells faintly of clove. Maybe orange rin something elegant and expensive. It's embroidered, worn soft with touch, but perfectly intact. A token of grace, a sign of civility. You lift it to your lips, bow your head, and kiss. But you do not smell her. You smell the story. A story built, not told. Layered, not spoken. And like all good stories, it doesn't begin at the beginning. It begins where memory wants it to begin, when everything was still beautiful. That's how the lie works. It doesn't shout, it perfumes, and it wins. Not because it's stronger than the truth, but because it's easier to breathe. The palace is full of these lies, pressed into velvet, dripped into oils, pinned into sachets that hang from skirts like promises no one can keep. Elizabeth didn't invent the lie, but she perfected it. She understood something most people never admit. Truth is crude. It smells like metal, like fear, like decay. It makes people flinch. But scent is suggestion. It gets in before logic. It tells your brain a different version of the room. One where no one is dying, where no one is aging, where no one is afraid. So she built her world from fragrance, layered herself in it, not to seduce, not to distract, but to govern. Every perfume was a policy, every powder a decree, every washcloth dipped in lavender was a treaty between body and myth. And the myth was this: she was more than mortal, untouched by sweat, unsullied by illness, immune to the filth that shaped everyone else's lives. Of course, it wasn't true, but no one said anything, because to say it out loud would make it real, and nobody wanted that. Not her courtiers, not her rivals, not her people, and certainly not the women who copied her rituals in their own homes, hoping to catch just a flicker of the untouchable. So the lie remained, not hidden, not buried, but agreed upon. That's the trick of it. This wasn't a lie shouted from balconies. It was a lie everyone chose to believe, not because they were stupid, because they were tired. Tired of mud, tired of stink, tired of reality grinding their bones down one winter at a time. And here she was, wrapped in lace and power, a beacon, a candle that never flickered. Why ruin it? Why pull back the curtain and say, she smells like abscess and clove oil. Her gown hasn't been washed in a season. Her corset leaves bruises she won't let anyone treat. Why speak the truth when the lie has perfume and music and divine lighting? The people didn't want honesty. They wanted beauty that survived the rot. So they let her lie. They kissed the gloves. They bowed before the scent. They bathed once a season and whispered of her daily lavender rinses, even when they saw her stumble, even when they noticed the sweat seeping through the armpits of the brocade. Even when her voice faltered, or her makeup cracked in the sun, they just closed their eyes and inhaled. Because if enough people believe a lie, it becomes civilization, and that's what Elizabeth ruled. Not just a country, but a consensus, an empire of silence, held together not by force, but by mutual agreement to never name the smell. The courtiers didn't speak, the servants didn't speak, the doctors didn't speak. Even the poets, those self-declared truth-tellers, compared her to roses instead of ruin. Not because they were cowards, because they understood the rules. Rule 1, you don't unmask power. Rule 2, you don't describe what lies beneath. Rule 3, if it's working, let it keep working. And it did. Until the end. Even as her health failed, even as her body collapsed beneath the weight of the myth she'd worn for too long, even as the perfumes clashed with the odour of infection, still, no one said a word. They bowed. They smiled. They recited poems at her bedside quiet, rhythmic, lavender-scented lies. Because what else could they do? Admit it. Say it out loud. She's dying. She's human. She smells like us. No, that would have been cruelty. So instead, they leaned in closer and lied one more time. The final act. One more dab of rosewater. One more fresh glove. One more touch-up of her lips so she wouldn't meet death looking too mortal. And when she passed, they didn't wash her right away. They let her rest, so the scent could linger, so the illusion could set, so history wouldn't remember the bruises, the bloating, the body struggling to keep its contract with myth. History remembers what was perfumed, not what rotted. And that is the beautiful lie, that she smelled like royalty, always, that even when her body broke, her legend did not, because no one let it, because no one wanted to live in a world where beauty couldn't be sustained by force of will and lavender. So they kept the myth. They embalmed it not with oils, but consent. They passed it down. They taught it in schools, painted it in oils, spoke it in documentaries. She was the Virgin Queen, the glorious Queen, the scented Queen, the Queen who never aged, never sweated, never bled, never smelled like a human being. And that is the lie that outlived her. Not because it was true, because we needed it to be, because the alternative was too sad, too real, too common. So we said nothing, and the silence like perfume filled the room. Tonight, when you lie down to sleep, take a breath. The air around you is quiet. It smells like nothing in particular, maybe detergent, maybe the faint ghost of soap, maybe your own skin, clean from a hot shower not 2 hours ago. You're safe. You're washed. You're wrapped in cotton sheets that someone, somewhere, designed to be breathable, hypoallergenic, stain-resistant. You live in a world where the idea of clean is so ordinary, it's barely worth noticing. And yet you've just spent the past hour inside a world where cleanliness was a performance, where a queen coated herself in perfume because to smell like a person was to smell like failure, where water was feared, soap was rare, and beauty was something painted on over infection. Elizabeth I, the radiant monarch, the icon, the myth, she never knew what a warm shower felt like. She never sank into a clean bed without makeup on. She never once smelled like herself, not because she didn't want to, but because the world wouldn't let her. Because the price of being beautiful in the 16th century wasn't just discomfort, it was disappearance of scent, of body, of womanhood, all replaced by lavender, by powder, by the lie of fragrance over flesh. And tonight, you get to climb into bed without corset bruises on your ribs, without makeup sealing your pores, without a gown that's absorbed a month of sweat. That's not nothing. That's a small, quiet revolution, because in her world, sleep was not peace. It was a pause, a fragile, breathless intermission between performances. You get to rest, truly. No one's judging how your body smells in the dark. No one's peeking at your sheets. No one expects you to wake up beautiful. But Elizabeth, she never had that freedom, even asleep. She was not alone. There were whispers outside the door, eyes waiting to see if the Queen would wake, or fade, or falter. She slept in the residue of herself, in the scent of the day before, in the ache of beauty not yet undone. So tonight, if your sheets feel especially crisp, if your pillow smells faintly of laundry and nothing else, take a second, appreciate it, because this invisibility of scent, this neutrality of body, this gentle anonymity was once impossible. There was a time when every thread you wore told the story of what you'd eaten, how long you'd worked, who you'd been near, when people could smell your class, your job, your failure, and the lucky ones, the rich, the powerful, the royal. They didn't escape it. They just disguised it better, wrapped it in roses, called it elegance, built entire kingdoms on top of it. But deep down, underneath it all, we all smelled the same. So yes, you have soap now. You have deodorant. You have laundry cycles and clean underwear and fans that hum you to sleep. But you also have something more precious. You have honesty. You don't have to lie to be lovable. You don't have to perfume your pain. You don't have to fake freshness to be allowed in the room. You get to be human and still worthy. Elizabeth never had that. She had power, yes, but she also had lead on her cheeks and oil on her wrists and sweat pressed between velvet and skin until it became memory. She had people kiss gloves that had never touched water. She had to pretend, every day, that she did not exist in a body only in an image. So tonight, if you find yourself drifting towards sleep, remember that pillow you're lying on, it's clean, and you don't owe that to anyone but time. That smellless air around you, it's not empty. It's freeing. You're not staging anything. You're not being watched. You can close your eyes, and no one expects you to be divine by morning. And maybe, just maybe, that's what progress smells like. Not roses, not cedar, not imported musk from North Africa sealed in a pearl vial. Just nothing. Just breath. And sheets. And the soft scent of a body that no longer has to apologize for being real. History is full of people who lived beautiful lies. Lies that helped them survive. Lies that built thrones. But you get to live something better. You get to live truthfully. And that, in its own quiet way, is a kind of royalty. So sleep well. And if you dream of queens tonight, let them be soft. Let them be real. Let them finally rest in sheets that don't carry the weight of their perfume. And now, as the candle of this story burns low and your breathing slows, let me leave you with one final thought. The past doesn't go away. It lingers, not in facts, not in timelines, but in textures, in sounds, and yes, in smells. We love to imagine history as something pristine, sorted, clean. But the truth, the real truth, is that it was sticky, heavy, and faintly sweet with rot. It clung to the skin and to the soul. It was not something you read. It was something you wore. And that's why we're here. That's why this strange little channel exists. Boring history for sleep isn't really about being boring. It's about peeling back the powdered faces and polished myths and finding the warmth, the weirdness, and the quiet truth of what it meant to be human before hot water and high thread counts. We're not here for dates. We're here for drapes soaked with perfume, for gloves no one washed, for thrones that smelled like someone had been afraid to leave them for too long. Because when you stop expecting the past to be clean, you finally understand why it matters. So if tonight's story helped you drift into restore, at least made you look at your laundry basket with fresh gratitude, know that you're not alone. There are thousands of us across the world tuning in each night, closing our eyes, and letting boring history for sleep whisper us into a different time. Sometimes that time is ugly, sometimes is unexpectedly funny, sometimes it's soft in a way we didn't expect, but it's always real and strangely comforting, because no matter how far we travel back, the past always brings us back to one truth, that sleep is sacred, and so is the story that rocks us into it. Thank you for being here, for letting this old world seep through the edges of your modern one, for lighting a candle beside mine. I hope you found a little stillness tonight, a little oddness, a little truth. And if you ever forget what history felt like, just remember this. It wasn't always clean, but it was always alive. I'll see you next time, right here on Boring History for Sleep, where we don't just tell history, we breathe it. Good night.